You are just a clerk in a robe, Madison Whitmore said, laughing softly from the defense table as if the courtroom were another private room her father had paid to reserve. The sound moved through courtroom 3 like a cold draft. A pen stopped in Clerk Emily Harris's hand. Bailiff Raymond Cole straightened near the side wall. Attorney Grant Keller turned his head toward his client so quickly that the leather of his chair gave a sharp little creak. In the first row behind them, Charles Whitmore, millionaire real estate developer and father of the defendant, did not look shocked. He looked irritated that his daughter had said the quiet part too loudly. Judge Nathaniel Brooks lifted his eyes from the probation violation file. He was 58, black, calm behind a dark wooden bench polished by decades of other people's fear, anger, excuses, and truth. The morning light came through the tall courthouse windows in narrow strips, touching the court seal on the wall behind him, the worn edges of the American flag, and the silver nameplate on the bench. Madison sat in a cream designer blazer, blonde hair smooth, diamond bracelet bright against her wrist, phone face down but still glowing beside her legal pad. At 24, she carried herself like court was a delay between brunch and a spa appointment, not a room where another person's pain had been entered into public record. Judge Brooks did not raise his voice. He did not strike the gavel. He only looked toward the clerk. Let the record reflect the defendant's statement. Madison's smile weakened by a fraction, not because she felt sorry, but because she had expected anger and received procedure. Your Honor, Attorney Keller said quickly, standing halfway, my client is under stress and did not intend disrespect. Judge Brooks looked at him. Then the record will also reflect counsel's explanation. The courtroom stayed silent. Mrs. Lillian Price sat 2 rows back with both hands folded over the handle of her cane, her small frame wrapped in a navy cardigan, her eyes lowered toward the victim impact statement resting on her lap. She was 67, black, dignified in the way people become when life has taught them that trembling and standing can happen at the same time. Madison had been placed on probation months earlier after a reckless incident that damaged Mrs. Price's small porch, frightened her grandchildren, and left bills Madison's family promised would be handled quietly. The promise had become paperwork. The paperwork had become delays. The delays had become violations. Now Madison shifted in her chair and whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. This is so dramatic. Judge Brooks turned one page in the file. Ms. Whitmore, he said, voice even, you will stand when addressing the court, your phone will remain off, and you will face forward while Mrs. Price's statement is read. Madison rolled her eyes but stood, slow and theatrical. Charles Whitmore leaned toward his lawyer. Attorney Keller placed a calming hand on the table, though his own face had tightened. Judge Brooks watched none of the performance for longer than necessary. He had seen money enter courtrooms before, dressed as confidence, softened by apologies written by people who would never feel the consequence. He had also seen poor defendants shake beneath ceilings like this, terrified of a system that never softened for them. That difference mattered to him. Clerk Harris, he said, please note the defendant's phone use, statement to the court, and courtroom demeanor before we proceed. Madison's chin lifted. Are you serious? Judge Brooks looked directly at her then, not offended, not impressed, not afraid of her last name. This room is. Judge Nathaniel Brooks had not learned restraint from law books first. He had learned it in a second-floor apartment above a laundromat on the east side of Cleveland, where winter came through the windows even when the heat was running and his mother worked night shifts cleaning hospital rooms with swollen hands she hid inside cotton gloves. Back then, Nathaniel was just a skinny black boy who carried groceries up 2 flights of stairs and watched neighbors count rent in folded bills at kitchen tables. He knew what it meant for a person to enter a courthouse afraid that one mistake, one missed payment, one impatient judge, or one expensive lawyer on the other side could change the shape of a life. Years later, as a public defender, he had stood beside men and women who could not afford polished excuses. He had watched poor defendants apologize before anyone asked them to speak. He had watched mothers clutch bus schedules because court ran late and daycare closed early. He had watched people punished not only for what they did, but for not knowing how to sound acceptable while explaining it. That history sat with him now beneath the black robe, quiet but alive. Courtroom 3 was not grand, but to Judge Brooks it carried weight. The wood rail was scratched from years of nervous hands. The jury box smelled faintly of old varnish. The ceiling lights hummed above rows of benches where citizens came carrying fear, anger, grief, and sometimes arrogance polished into jewelry. He did not believe a courtroom was holy because a judge sat higher than everyone else. He believed it became worthy only when the poor could stand inside it without fear and the rich could not laugh their way out. Madison Whitmore remained standing at the defense table, chin lifted, still trying to make impatience look like confidence. Attorney Keller whispered something to her, but she barely listened. Charles Whitmore sat behind them with one ankle crossed over the other, silver watch visible beneath his cuff, expression tight with the annoyance of a man used to resolving trouble through private phone calls before public consequences arrived. Mrs. Lillian Price waited 2 rows back, both hands resting on her cane, her victim impact statement folded so carefully that the creases had softened from being opened and closed too many times. Judge Brooks noticed the way she watched the floor instead of Madison. That mattered too. Fear had a posture. So did entitlement. Clerk Harris waited at her keyboard. Bailiff Coles stood near the wall, his gaze steady but his jaw set, as if the insult to the court had also passed through him personally, and still had to be contained professionally. Judge Brooks turned to the file again. The first page listed Madison's original sentence: probation, restitution, community service, safe driving conditions, no contact with protected witnesses, and a required apology letter submitted through counsel. It had been a chance, not a decoration. He looked at Madison. "Ms. Whitmore, this hearing is not about whether the court feels respected. It is about whether you respected the conditions that kept you out of custody." Madison's eyes flicked toward her father. He gave no comfort, only a hard look toward the lawyer. Judge Brooks continued, voice even enough to leave no room for performance. "Mrs. Price will be heard. The record will be complete. And no last name in this courtroom will weigh more than the evidence." The words did not sound like anger. They sounded like a door closing softly, correctly, and for the first time that morning, Madison's smile had nowhere easy to sit. Madison Whitmore had grown up in places where consequences arrived softened, delayed, or redirected towards someone with less money to fight them. Her childhood had been gated streets, private school uniforms, summer homes with lake views, charity photos in glossy magazines, and dinner tables where adults spoke about judges, council members, police chiefs, and zoning boards as if public offices were names in a personal contact list. Her father, Charles Whitmore, had built half the county's luxury developments and donated enough money to have plaques on hospital wings, library walls, and campaign mailers that never used the word influence but lived on it anyway. Madison had learned early that apology could be outsourced. A damaged fence became a check. A complaint became a phone call. A school suspension became a misunderstanding. By 24, she no longer saw privilege as protection because protection had become the air around her. That was why Courtroom 3 annoyed her more than it frightened her. The wooden benches were old. The ceiling lights were too bright. The people were too serious. Mrs. Price's cane clicked once as she shifted in the second row, and Madison glanced back with irritation, as if the older woman's presence were an accusation she had already paid to remove. Attorney Keller leaned close. "Let me handle this," he whispered. Madison kept her eyes on Judge Brooks. "He is enjoying this," she whispered back, still loud enough for the front rows to hear. Clerk Harris's fingers paused above the keyboard, then resumed. Every word was becoming harder to erase. Judge Brooks looked down at the probation file, not at Madison's face, because arrogance often fed on being watched. "Counsel," he said, "please remind your client that side comments may be noted as courtroom conduct." Keller stood quickly. "Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Whitmore is prepared to listen respectfully." Madison gave a small laugh through her nose. Charles shifted behind her. His watch caught the morning light like a signal from another world. To Madison, Her father's presence meant the room had limits. It meant that somewhere behind the formal language, people would remember who funded what, who owned which building, who could make a call after lunch. She touched the edge of her diamond bracelet and looked toward the bench with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Can we just get to the part where this becomes community service again? The courtroom went still. Mrs. Price's fingers tightened around her cane. Bailiff Cole's posture sharpened by a fraction. Judge Brooks turned one page of the file, slowly, giving the sentence enough time to expose itself. That part already happened, he said. This hearing exists because you did not do it. Keller closed his eyes for half a second. Charles leaned forward, jaw firm. Madison's smile faltered, then returned thinner. My family has handled the restitution issue. Mrs. Price looked up then, and the pain in her eyes was quiet enough to shame anyone who still knew how. No, she said softly, before Keller could object. They handled paperwork. They did not handle me. Judge Brooks raised one hand, not to silence her harshly, but to protect the order of the room. Mrs. Price, you will have your full opportunity to speak. Then he looked at Madison, calm as the court seal behind him. And Ms. Whitmore will listen. For the first time, Madison looked less bored than cornered, because money had reached the bench and found no private door. Judge Brooks let the silence settle after Mrs. Price's words, not as punishment, but as protection. Some truths entered a courtroom so quietly that a careless voice could bruise them before they reached the record. Madison Whitmore stood at the defense table with her diamond bracelet catching the light, her cream blazer smooth, her face trying to rebuild the bored expression that had carried her through so many rooms before this one. But the old rhythm was failing her. Her father's money still sat behind her in the first row. Her attorney still had polished shoes, a leather briefcase, and a stack of prepared explanations. Yet none of it had stopped the clerk's fingers from recording every word. Judge Brooks turned toward Clerk Harris. The defendant will remain standing. Her phone will remain powered off and placed with counsel. The court will hear Mrs. Price's statement without interruption. Madison's head snapped up. You cannot take my phone. Bailiff Cole took one calm step forward, not threatening, only present. Judge Brooks looked at Attorney Keller. Counsel, secure your client's phone. Keller moved quickly, collecting the device before Madison could make another performance of it. She whispered, This is ridiculous. Judge Brooks did not look away from the file. Let the record reflect the defendant's additional comment. The sentence was plain, almost gentle, but it worked like a lock turning. Madison's cheeks colored. She looked over her shoulder toward Charles Whitmore, searching for the private rescue that had always arrived before discomfort became consequence. Charles leaned forward slightly, his voice low but sharp. Grant, ask for a recess. Keller stood. Your Honor, given the emotional nature of this hearing, the defense requests a brief recess to confer. Judge Brooks folded his hands over the probation file. Denied at this time. The victim has waited months to be heard. Mrs. Price lowered her eyes again, but her grip on the cane steadied. Madison gave a small scoff. Victim, she muttered, the word thin with disbelief. Judge Brooks finally looked directly at her. Ms. Whitmore, you damaged Mrs. Price's property, failed to complete community service, delayed restitution, ignored safe driving conditions, and are now before this court on multiple alleged violations. You will not reduce her to an inconvenience in this room. The courtroom seemed to breathe in once and hold it. Madison's mouth opened, then closed. Attorney Keller placed one hand lightly on the table, a silent warning to stop helping the prosecution more than he could. Judge Brooks turned to Clerk Harris. Please call the first violation. The clerk's voice was steady. Failure to complete 80 hours of community service by the court-ordered deadline. Keller rose. Your Honor, Ms. Whitmore had scheduling conflicts related to school and family obligations. Judge Brooks looked at Madison. Are you currently enrolled full-time? Keller hesitated. Madison shifted. Not this semester. The keys of Clerk Harris's keyboard clicked softly. Judge Brooks nodded once. Continue. Clerk Harris, read the next line. Failure to submit verified restitution payment directly through the court by the deadline. Charles whispered something under his breath. Judge Brooks's eyes lifted toward the gallery. Mr. Whitmore, you are seated in a public courtroom, not a private office. If you speak again without being called, Bailiff Cole will escort you outside. The millionaire's face hardened, but he sat back. Madison stared at the bench now, not with understanding yet, but with the first fear of a person realizing the exits she trusted were being closed one by one. Judge Brooks looked at Mrs. Price. Ma'am, when the record is ready, you will be heard fully. Mrs. Price nodded. The sunlight moved across the court seal behind him, slow and impartial. In that room, power was no longer the loudest voice. Procedure was. Clerk Harris continued reading, and with each line Madison Whitmore's confidence lost a little more of its polished shape. Failure to complete 80 hours of community service. Failure to submit restitution through the court. Failure to attend required driver accountability sessions. Failure to provide proof of safe driving compliance. Unauthorized online posts referencing the victim impact process. Attorney Keller stood again, slower this time, as if even his expensive suit could feel the record tightening around his client. Your Honor, some of these items are technical violations. Ms. Whitmore is young, she has no prior custodial history, and her family has made every effort to resolve the matter responsibly. From the second row, Mrs. Price's cane gave one soft tap against the floor when her hand shifted. Judge Brooks noticed the sound. So did Madison, who glanced back with irritation before catching herself too late. Technical, Judge Brooks repeated, not as sarcasm, but as a word being tested for weight. He turned another page. Mrs. Price waited 3 months for restitution that was ordered through this court, not through private arrangements. She reported unwanted contact from an associate of the defendant's family. She appeared today after receiving public comments online that made light of this proceeding. Is that the defense's position, that these are technical matters? Keller's face tightened. The defense does not wish to minimize harm. Madison leaned toward him and whispered, Then stop making it sound like I ruined someone's life. The whisper was not low enough. Mrs. Price lowered her eyes. Bailiff Cole's jaw set. Clerk Harris typed every word, her face controlled, her fingers precise. Judge Brooks looked at Madison for one quiet second. Ms. Whitmore, you will not speak while counsel is addressing the court unless I ask you a question. Madison folded her arms, diamond bracelet flashing against the cream sleeve. My father owns half this county, she muttered. This time, the room did not merely go silent. It froze. Charles Whitmore stood from the first row before Keller could stop him. Your Honor, I think this has gone far enough. My daughter is emotional, and this court is turning a probation hearing into a public spectacle. Bailiff Cole moved one step closer to the gallery aisle, calm and controlled. Judge Brooks did not raise the gavel. He did not need to. Mr. Whitmore, sit down. Charles remained standing, his face red with disbelief that anyone had spoken to him that way in a public room. I have supported this county for 30 years. Judge Brooks looked at him steadily. Then you should know better than to interrupt its court. The sentence struck softly and held. Charles sat, but not gracefully. Madison stared at the bench now, her smile gone, replaced by the first sharp outline of fear. The room she thought her father could bend had not bent. The judge she thought she could insult had not become personal. That made him more dangerous than anger would have. Judge Brooks turned back to the clerk. Continue. Clerk Harris read the final lines. Alleged contact with a protected witness through a third party. Failure to submit required written apology. Failure to appear for 2 scheduled community service dates without verified cause. Keller exhaled. Your Honor, we ask the court to consider continued probation with stricter reporting. Judge Brooks closed the file halfway, then looked toward Mrs. Price. Before the court considers disposition, Mrs. Price will be heard. Mrs. Price rose carefully, both hands on her cane. The wood tip touched the floor once, then steadied. Madison looked at her, really looked this time, not because compassion had arrived fully, but because every escape had begun to close. Mrs. Price held her folded statement with trembling fingers and lifted her chin toward the bench. The courtroom waited, and for once, even money had to listen. Mrs. Price unfolded her statement with hands that trembled just enough for the paper to whisper in the stillness. She did not look at Madison first. She looked at Judge Brooks, then at Clerk Harris, then at the court seal behind the bench, as if reminding herself that this room was supposed to hold what she had carried alone for months. "I am not here because of a porch," she began, voice soft but clear. "Wood can be repaired. Steps can be replaced. Bills can be paid. I am here because after it happened, I stopped feeling safe in my own home." Madison's face changed, not fully, not kindly yet, but something in her expression loosened under the weight of hearing the harm spoken without decoration. Mrs. Price continued, both hands resting on the statement now. She spoke about grandchildren who no longer ran to the front door when they heard a car outside. She spoke about phone calls promised by representatives who never called back, about restitution discussed like a business inconvenience, about seeing online posts that made the hearing sound like a joke before she had been allowed to describe what fear had done to her sleep. No one interrupted. Attorney Keller kept his eyes on the table. Charles Whitmore sat rigid in the first row, stripped of the power to convert discomfort into privacy. Bailiff Cole stood near the wall, face steady, hands folded before him. Judge Brooks listened without writing for several seconds. Some testimony deserved more than notes. It deserved a room that did not rush away from it. Beneath the edge of his robe, his thumb touched the old bracelet hidden under his sleeve, a thin braided band his mother had worn through years of work and worry. She had given it to him after his first week as a public defender, when he came home angry because a landlord's lawyer had laughed at a tenant who could barely read the notice that could remove her from her apartment. His mother had taken his hand and said, "A courtroom is only holy when the poor can stand inside it without fear." He had carried those words longer than any statute. He looked down at the probation file, at the photographs of damaged porch rails, at the missed service dates, the delayed restitution record, the online screenshots, the reported third-party contact, the transcript line where Madison had called him a clerk in a robe. None of it was about his pride. That mattered. A judge who punished insult instead of evidence was only another kind of danger. He lifted his eyes as Mrs. Price finished. "I just wanted her to understand that people without money still have homes, still have families, still have mornings they are trying to get through." The paper lowered. Silence filled the courtroom, warm now, no longer empty. Judge Brooks nodded once. "Thank you, Mrs. Price." Madison stared at the older woman's cane, then at the floor. For the first time that morning, her face did not look bored. It looked young in a way privilege had hidden, young enough to realize that consequence was not cruelty simply because it had finally reached her. Judge Brooks rested both hands on the file. Outside the windows, sunlight moved across the bench and stopped at the edge of the court seal. The room waited for him to speak, and he waited one breath longer, making certain that what came next belonged to justice, not anger. Judge Brooks let Mrs. Price's final sentence remain in the air until it no longer sounded like testimony and began to sound like truth. Madison Whitmore stood at the defense table with her hands clasped in front of her now, diamond bracelet half hidden beneath her sleeve, phone gone, smile gone, the easy boredom gone from her face. She had mocked the robe, rolled her eyes at the record, dismissed the victim, and reached for her father's name like it was a second legal defense. But the room had changed while she was busy performing above it. The probation file had grown heavier. Clerk Harris's transcript had become precise. Mrs. Price's voice had turned damage into something no check could politely erase. Judge Brooks looked toward the clerk. "Please read the verified violations into the record one final time." Clerk Harris adjusted the paper before her and began with the clean, steady voice of someone who understood that accuracy could be a form of protection. "Failure to complete 80 hours of community service by the ordered deadline. Failure to submit verified restitution through the court. Failure to attend required driver accountability sessions. Failure to provide proof of safe driving compliance. Unauthorized online comments regarding the victim impact process. Reported third-party contact with a protected witness. Failure to submit the required written apology. Failure to appear for 2 scheduled community service dates without verified cause. Each line landed without drama, and that made it harder for Madison to fight. Attorney Keller stood slowly. Your Honor, the defense acknowledges mistakes were made. Ms. Whitmore is prepared to comply with stricter conditions, additional service, increased reporting, and any financial obligation the court considers appropriate. Judge Brooks looked at Madison. Ms. Whitmore, before I rule, do you wish to address the people harmed by your choices? Madison's mouth opened with the old reflex of defense, then stopped. Her eyes moved toward Mrs. Price, who had lowered herself carefully back onto the bench, both hands resting on her cane. For the first time, Madison seemed to see not a problem, not an obstacle, not a poor woman attached to paperwork, but a person whose home had become less peaceful because Madison had treated consequence like an inconvenience. Madison began, but the word broke under the weight of everything she had already said. Charles leaned forward, panic tightening his face. Madison, do not speak without grant. Judge Brooks turned his eyes toward him. Mr. Whitmore, this is your final warning. Bailiff Cole took one measured step closer to the first row. Charles sat back, furious but silent. Madison swallowed. I am sorry, she said, but the words were small, late, and unsure of themselves. Mrs. Price did not nod. She did not owe Madison comfort. Judge Brooks looked back at the file, at the court seal, at the transcript, at the probation order signed months earlier with mercy already built into it. This court gave you an opportunity to remain in the community under clear conditions, he said. You treated those conditions as suggestions. You treated restitution as a private inconvenience. You treated the victim as background. And today, you treated this courtroom as if dignity were optional when money was present. Attorney Keller lowered his head slightly. Madison's face went pale. Judge Brooks's voice did not grow louder. It grew clearer. The court will impose the maximum sentence allowed under this order. The sentence fell through courtroom 3 with the weight of a door closing from the inside. Madison froze. Her father's hand tightened on the bench rail. Keller stood motionless, every prepared argument suddenly too small. Mrs. Price closed her eyes for one breath, not celebrating, only releasing something she had carried too long. Judge Brooks did not look triumphant. He looked tired in the way justice sometimes looks when it finally arrives after being delayed by money, arrogance, and fear. Clerk Harris typed the ruling. Bailiff Cole remained still. The court seal behind the bench caught a strip of sunlight, plain and bright, as if the room itself had remembered what it was built to hold. Charles Whitmore rose again before the sound of Clerk Harris's typing had faded, but this time his movement did not carry command. It carried panic dressed as outrage. Your Honor, this is excessive, he said, voice strained, one hand gripping the back of the bench in front of him. My daughter made mistakes, but this court is overreaching. Attorney Keller turned toward him sharply. Mr. Whitmore, please sit down. Madison stood frozen beside the defense table, her face pale, her lips parted as if the word maximum had taken the air from the room and left her with nothing polished enough to replace it. Judge Brooks looked at Charles, not with surprise and not with anger. Mr. Whitmore, you were warned. Bailiff Cole stepped forward with quiet discipline, his presence firm but controlled, a reminder that order did not need to be loud to be real. Charles looked at the bailiff, then at the judge, then around the room as if searching for someone who still remembered the size of his donations, the buildings with his name, the dinners where officials laughed at his table. No one moved to help him. Judge Brooks spoke with the same even tone he had used from the beginning. No one owns this room. The sentence emptied Charles's face of its last confident defense. He sat down slowly, not humbled enough to be transformed, but quiet enough to stop harming his daughter's case with his pride. Judge Brooks turned back to Madison. Ms. Whitmore, the sentence is imposed under the existing probation order and the violations read into the record. This is not punishment for insulting the court. The court is not fragile. This is accountability for repeated disregard of lawful conditions and repeated disregard for the person harmed by your choices. Madison's eyes shifted toward Mrs. Price. The older woman was seated again, both hands over her cane, her shoulders small beneath the navy cardigan, her face tired in a way money could never reimburse. Madison looked at her for longer than she had all morning. Something broke then, but it did not look dramatic. It looked like recognition arriving late and finding damage already waiting. I did not think, Madison whispered. Judge Brooks heard her, but he did not rescue her from the sentence. That is why courts keep records, he said. So people are not protected by what they refuse to think about. Attorney Keller lowered his head. Charles stared at the floor. Clerk Harris finished entering the ruling, each keystroke clean and final. Bailiff Cole remained near the aisle, not touching anyone, not displaying force, only guarding the room so Truth could finish speaking. Madison wiped one tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, careful now, almost embarrassed by the simplicity of being unable to buy her way out of what had become real. She turned slightly toward Mrs. Price. I am sorry, she said again, quieter than before. This time the words carried less performance, but they still arrived after months of delay, after public jokes, after misservice, after the courtroom had been forced to drag her toward the humanity she had stepped around. Mrs. Price looked at her for a moment. I hope you mean that one day, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not cruelty. It was a boundary spoken by a woman who had earned the right to keep her peace guarded. Judge Brooks nodded once, accepting the truth of that boundary. The clerk will provide written orders. Counsel will review appellate rights and reporting instructions with the defendant. Restitution remains enforceable through the court. Madison nodded without lifting her eyes. The diamond bracelet on her wrist no longer looked like armor. It looked like decoration on a hand that had finally stopped reaching for exits. As the hearing moved toward its close, the courtroom did not erupt, did not celebrate, did not become the spectacle Charles had accused it of being. It simply returned to order. The file closed. The record held. Mrs. Price sat a little straighter. And Judge Brooks, behind the bench, kept his hand near the old bracelet under his sleeve, remembering that justice was not made wholly by severity, but by refusing to let money decide whose pain mattered. After the hearing ended, Courtroom 3 emptied slowly, as if everyone inside it understood that leaving too quickly would disrespect what had just been placed on the record. Attorney Keller gathered his files in silence. Charles Whitmore walked out with his jaw tight and his phone already in his hand, but even he did not speak loudly beneath the court seal. Madison followed her attorney with her eyes lowered, the cream blazer still perfect, the diamond bracelet still bright, yet none of it seemed able to lift her above the sound of Clerk Harris printing the order. Bailiff Cole opened the side door with quiet professionalism, and Madison paused for one brief second near Mrs. Price. No one forced a moment between them. No one staged forgiveness for the comfort of the room. Mrs. Price remained seated with both hands on her cane, her navy cardigan folded softly around her shoulders, watching the young woman not as an enemy, but as someone who had finally reached the edge of consequence and discovered that it had a face. Madison's lips moved, but no words came. Maybe the apology had already been said too late. Maybe she understood that another apology, spoken for witnesses, would only make the silence heavier. She turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a gentle sound. The courtroom did not cheer. It did not condemn her again. It simply kept the record. Clerk Harris turned off the recording system, checked the timestamp, and stacked the transcript pages in a neat pile beside the probation file. Bailiff Cole waited until the gallery was clear, then looked toward the bench. All clear, Judge. Judge Brooks nodded. Thank you, Mr. Cole. The bailiff left through the side aisle, his footsteps fading across the polished floor. Mrs. Price stood carefully, leaning on her cane. Judge Brooks rose slightly from the bench, not enough to turn the moment into ceremony, only enough to honor her effort. She looked up at him, eyes tired but steadier than they had been that morning. "Thank you for letting me finish," she said. Judge Brooks rested one hand near the closed file. "You should not have had to fight for the chance." Mrs. Price nodded once, not with joy, but with the quiet relief of someone whose pain had finally been allowed to stand upright in public. She turned toward the aisle and walked slowly out of the courtroom, the cane touching the floor in soft, measured taps. When the door closed behind her, Judge Brooks sat alone for a moment. Sunlight from the tall windows had shifted across the bench and now rested on the empty defense chair where Madison had laughed. The court seal glowed faintly on the wall. The American flag stood still. Under his sleeve, his thumb found the old braided bracelet his mother had left him, worn smooth by years of memory. He thought of her voice, of the apartment above the laundromat, of all the people who entered rooms like this afraid that money would speak louder than truth. The file before him was closed, but the purpose of the room remained open. Justice did not feel like victory. It felt like weight carried correctly for one more day. Judge Brooks looked once at Mrs. Price's empty seat, then at the polished floor where morning light had moved and changed nothing except what it revealed. He stood, gathered the file, and stepped down from the bench. Behind him, the courtroom settled into silence, and in that silence, the law finally sounded human.